Our next topic is the classification of life. When we study the classification of life, there are a number of different fields of study within it. Now, there are a number of different subgroups of how we can go about classifying organisms. The field of taxonomy is the study of grouping and naming things. So, traditionally, it's done with shared characteristics. And so, there's a hierarchy of grouping. So this is the broadest, and then it gets more specific and more specific and more specific as you get to smaller and smaller groups. A very related field is something called phylogeny. It's basically classification, but it's classification based on evolutionary relationships. So what we care more about, instead of similarities, is who's more closely related to whom. When we discuss phylogeny, a lot of times Darwin's tree of life comes up, because remember, Darwin thought that all organisms were related, and phylogeny basically shows how they're related. To give you a better feeling of the difference between phylogeny and taxonomy, we can look at dinosaurs and birds. In taxonomy, dinosaurs and birds would be grouped as two different taxa, or two different levels of organization. One would be reptiles and one would be birds, both of which are considered classes of vertebrates. Phylogeny instead would identify a bird as a descendant of a dinosaur, which is the reptile, and so it would show birds as part of dinosaurs' subgroup. Let's take a moment and review. Today's classification systems are based on the work of a person named Carl von Linné. He was a Swedish biologist that was living in the 1700s, so way before Darwin's time. And he was the first person to establish the taxa. Taxa just refers to the system of grouping and the levels of grouping. So you've probably heard of kingdom and class and order and so forth. Those are different taxa, or different levels of grouping. Quick side note, taxon would be the singular version of that. And he ranked them from the broadest to the most specific. Each time you got more specific, you got to a smaller and smaller group. Originally, there were 5 different taxa from broadest to most specific. Now there's technically 8, but we kind of get around that because we have like subgroupings and super groups. But officially, there are 8. So the taxonomic levels. The way to remember it, the mnemonic that I remember is Dear King Philip came over for good spaghetti. I know another teacher who has it in the reverse order. Mine is from broadest to most specific. Notice it's Dear King Philip, and I have in parentheses Dear King David. We'll talk about why that is in just a second. You should know the order of them. So you're probably familiar with a lot of the taxa that go with those mnemonics. The terms mammals, Homo sapiens, fungi, eukaryotes, mollusks, conifers, primate, rodent, arthropod, plant, reptile, and gymnosperm. Hopefully you've heard of a lot of those words, and all of those words represent one of the levels of taxa. For example, fungi is a kingdom, mammal is a class, primate is an order. So one of the ones that was not on there is domain. When I was in high school, I didn't learn domain. It's a more recent term. It's the most general group, and it's grouped by sharing the most basic of cell structure. Either you're a prokaryote or a eukaryote. Within the prokaryotes, there's so many prokaryotes that they've actually divided them further based on additional cell components. But most general is are you a prokaryote or a eukaryote? There are 3 domains. We'll learn about that later in the unit. And again, it's new. In the 90s, which is when I was in high school, I know, I'm really old. But in the 90s, it hadn't trickled down to high school level. It was taught maybe at collegiate level. An example domain would be eukarya, and it describes all of the eukaryotes that exist. So all fungi, plants, animals, and protists would all be one domain. Domain is further broken down into kingdoms, which is probably something you're familiar to. Kingdom in the past was the most traditional group, and all of the members of a kingdom share a common cell structure. So in addition to being either eukaryote or prokaryote, which is at the domain level, all of the members of a kingdom all share the same cell structure that we learned in our cell unit. So having an animal cell means having no cell wall, having no chloroplast, etc. having a plant cell means having chloroplast, having a cell wall, and so forth. And so we can clarify, we can differentiate the kingdoms based on what cell type they have. We also describe what way they have of getting nutrients, and a number of other similarities between them. There are currently described as 6 kingdoms, although there's debate out. Some will go as high as 8. Animalia, or the animal kingdom, is an example of a kingdom. Phyla is our next level. Phyla is the next most specific. The singular is phylum, and it's not exactly a phyla, but vertebrates might be a close example of something you might be familiar with, or all of the plants that make flowers are an example of phyla. Just because biologists don't give you enough vocabulary, for some we happen to use division. Typically it's plants and fungi. And that's where Dear King David would come over for good spaghetti. It's not a particularly huge importance, but if you see that, that's what it is. So an example of phyla would be Chordata, which I said is mostly the vertebrates. There's actually a little bit more to it than that, but mostly vertebrate animals. Phyla are then broken down into classes. An example would be Mammalia. Classes are then broken down into smaller groups with similarities called orders. Example of an order would be Carnivora. Orders are then broken down into smaller groups called families. Example of a family would be Felidae, or the cat family. A genera, or genus is the more common, genera is plural. Genus is our next level, so Felis would be a smaller subgroup of the cat family. And finally, the most specific level that we talk about here officially is the species. So remember, the same species have the most similarities and the most relatedness of all of the levels of taxa. And what makes the members of the same species part of the same species is that they can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. So an example would be Sylvestris. So Felis sylvestris would be like the house cat. But as I mentioned, that these are the main levels of taxonomy. A lot of times we have subgroups, so subspecies or breeds. Those are members of the individuals who have similarities and can interbreed, but maybe they're not officially interbreeding because they're in 2 different parts of the continent, or they have an accrued number of differences, like different kinds of breeds. But they still can technically interbreed, and so we would still call them the same species. Take a look at my visual of the taxa. So the domain would be the most broad group, and it would include everything you see on the top, the eukarya. And so even this amoeba, which is a eukaryote, a single-celled eukaryote, would be in the same group. Our next most specific would be an amoeba, and would be an Animalia kingdom. And notice the amoeba is no longer in the picture. As we get to chordates, as I said, chordates is mostly vertebrate animals, so our octopus is out. We narrow it down to Mammalia, and now we get rid of the turtle because the turtle is a reptile. Narrow it down even further, and we get rid of the dolphin because it's not considered part of the order Carnivora. It is a carnivore, but it's not part of the group that we call Carnivora. We narrow it down even further, and we get to Felidae, which is just the cats. That the wolf is out now. Genus then eliminates the cheetah, which, although it's cat, is not in the same genus as the house cat. And we get to the species, and the species Sylvestris refers to house cat, so we get rid of the puma. Make a note, as you go down from domain to species, you're getting more similarities and more relatedness. There's been a debate in taxonomy for a number of years, and that is just how many levels we should have and how many kingdoms and domains, and it's constantly in flux. Just this week in my inbox, I got an email from another teacher about how, oh my goodness, there's 20 phyla of animals, and we had been teaching 10. And it's not that there are that many new animals being discovered, although there certainly are many species we haven't identified. But as we learn more about the species, we take advantage of DNA technology to combine their DNA, and we learn more about their structures, and we find more fossil evidence. We're constantly reanalyzing what we think is in terms of who's related to whom and what similarities are actually out there. And so in Linnaeus's day, fish and whales would have been grouped together because they both look very similar, even though now we know that they're very, very different. One's a fish and one's a mammal, and that means profound differences. He would group them together, and now we group them separately. So this is constantly in flux. So let's take a minute and review. So when we talk classification, we run into a little bit of a problem. If you look at this, and I asked you to tell me what kind of organism this was, or at least what species, some of you would call it a puma. Some of you might call it a mountain lion, and some of you might call me a cougar, and some of you might tell me that it's a Florida panther. And all of you would be true. That's because regionally we have different names for this animal. Mountain lion, cougar, panther are all the same species. So in science, when we say a finch or we say a cat, we need to be very specific about what species we're talking about because we have different groupings all over the world. And when we're talking about things like their characteristics or their conservation, because many of them are endangered, we need to know exactly what species we're talking about. So binomial nomenclature, or our scientific naming, allows for the fact that there are different names for things like crawdad, crayfish, and mudbug, all different regional names for the same crustacean. Also, over time, word meanings tend to shift, less so with names of animals, but they tend to shift. So, cool now, of course, usually means, hey, neat, I like that. And cool can also mean, burr, it's cold out. We use Latin because it's unlikely to change since nobody speaks it on a regular basis. And in Linnaeus' time, when he made these, they used to be really, 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 really long. And now we've narrowed it to just 2 names to describe a species. As I mentioned, Linnaeus was the one that came up with this. And Carl von Linné, his original name, he actually changed his name to Carolus Linnaeus because he was really into this. So when we name species, we have a couple of rules. As I mentioned, it's called binomial nomenclature. Binomial means two names. So we use the genus and the species. So here's our format. If we're writing it out, both have to be italicized. So if we're typing it up, we put both in italics. If you're writing by hand, a lot of times it's underlined instead. But anytime it's typed on a computer, it's italicized. Genus is always capitalized and the species is not. So for example, you've probably heard the term Homo sapien. Homo sapien is the human species name, and Homo is our genus, sapien is our species, and we'd write it all out we'd write it all out in italics. Notice Homo is capitalized and sapien is not. Another example would be Canis lupus, which is the wolf and the dog. Robin turdus is the Turdus migratorius. Notice they all have that same structure. 2 words, first one's capitalized, the second one is not, all in italicized. However, sometimes, like let's say you're writing a paper in college on a species, the first time you write it out, you write the whole thing, but after that it gets a little tedious. And so we can abbreviate it sometimes, and we would abbreviate the genus. So H. sapien is Homo sapien, Canis lupus would be C. lupus, and Turdus migratorius would be T. migratorius. One that's written like this a lot of times that you've probably heard of is E. coli. That's a type of bacteria. Let's take another minute and review. We've been talking for the last couple of slides about taxonomy, or just simply how we name and group things. The more modern focus, instead of looking at just naming and grouping, is the study of phylogeny, or in other words, as I mentioned, how organisms are related to one another. When we study phylogeny, what we care about is evolutionary descent. In other words, who are the descendants of common ancestors? If we use your family instead of species, we would say that there's different levels of relatedness. So your immediate family would be very closely related. And then if we included like your cousins and your aunts, they would all be the descendants of your grandparents. And then we could go up to great grandparents and so forth. And each time we'd get a larger and larger group. So thinking of it this way is phylogeny. And if we think about the difference, when we have these 5 bears, or these 5 animals traditionally been known as bears, we have the panda bear, the red panda, the koala bear, the brown bear, maybe grizzly, and the polar bear. In Linnaeus' time, they all would have just been bears. Thanks to phylogeny, we now know that some are bears, some aren't, and we can see who's more closely related. So according to phylogeny, we can look and see that the red panda is actually a raccoon, or related to raccoon anyway. And the giant panda, which traditionally we thought of as just 2 different species of panda, is actually a bear. The koala, you can see, is not on this diagram at all because the koala is very distantly related. The koala is more closely related to a wallaby and a kangaroo than it is to a bear. And so phylogeny allows us to look and see who's actually more closely related instead of just who looks like each other. Let's take another second and review. The diagram of the bears, and the one here, is something known as a cladogram, and it's basically a diagram showing us evolutionary lineage. You might think of it as a species family tree. We sometimes call it phylogenetic tree. On cladograms, a lot of the times what we show are these structures on the bottom. Those structures are called derived characters, and they are characteristics that all of the descendants had in common. So, for example, if we look at the salamander, the turtle, and the leopard, they're all land animals, and they're all characterized by either having 4 walking legs or having ancestors that had 4 walking legs. So, for example, the snake would go up here with the turtle. It doesn't have 4 walking legs, but it had ancestors that did. When we take a look, we can see groups of common ancestors. So we have this is a group of common ancestors. This is a smaller group of common ancestors. They had a more recent ancestor that would have been about here. And that is a group that has a common ancestors. Those circles I highlighted on the previous slide are called clades. So they're just groups of related organisms and all of their descendants. That's important. So it has to have every single organism represented on the cladogram included in that. They can be big or small. The previous slide, there was the rabbit and the primate that was in one clade that would be essentially the mammals, or they had a much larger one. The larger one typically occurred longer ago in history. And if you have a branch, it has to be the entire branch. You can't exclude a group from it, because then it wouldn't be all of the ancestors. And again, where those branch points are is where there was a common ancestor. If we look, cladograms can be written 2 different ways. Here it's more of the bracket form, and in the other diagrams it's been the pyramid or the triangle form. Both are just fine. If we take a look on the top, they're clades. So here, this group of blue would be common ancestor, and this would represent one group of its descendants. Here would also be a clade. It would be a common ancestor, and it would include all of the descendants. A descendant would each be at the top of the branches. This pink box is not a clade, because if we wanted to include this group with this other group, we'd have to go back to their most common ancestor, which their lines did not combine until down here. And so to include all of their descendants, we'd have to include all of the organisms in this cladogram. And in the orange box, same thing. If we want to put this group with this group, we'd have to include all of the common ancestors of an ancestor that's here, all the descendants of an ancestor that's here, which means we have to include that group. This is the same exact thing, just written in triangle form. I wanted to show you that both are acceptable ways of writing a cladogram. So when we look at our clades, this is a clade, this is a clade, but even though these two are right next to each other, they're not a clade, because the most common ancestor would have been down at the bottom here, which means we have to include the T-Rex or the Saurian dinosaurs. Let's take another moment and review. When we've got a lot of groups that certainly seem like they could be very closely related, or even sometimes the same group, we then have to have a process for identifying what kind of organism we're actually dealing with. And so the way that biologists do that is a dichotomous key. Imagine you're walking through the woods and you find an insect. If you're a biologist and you're studying that insect, there's a series of steps we can take to figure out if that's the right kind of insect. So a dichotomous key is a tool used to identify organisms, and I think of it kind of like a treasure map, or more of like a scavenger hunt. Once you go to one place, once you answer one question, you go on to the next question, and so forth. So it's a series of steps, and each step presents the user with a choice of 2 options. It's either this or that. When you choose one of the options, you're essentially eliminating the entire rest of the group, and therefore then you're narrowing down your choices. Eventually, it will guide you to the group name. It can be in list form. It can also be in a diagram form, or essentially a flowchart. If we look at our dolphin cladogram, we have 4 different dolphin members. And yes, the orca is a dolphin. Um, when we look to see what they are, we can start with, let's say, this one here, the second one in. To figure out its species name, we first ask ourselves question number 1, and our choices are A or B. So is it mostly solid, or is it colored black, white, and gray? Well, the second choice here is colored black, white, and gray, so we go to step 2. Does it have a sharply pointed beak, or does it have a gradually pointed beak? Well, sometimes it helps to compare what our choices are. So if we look at the other ones, I would say that the third one and the first one have a more sharply pointed beak, whereas this guy here definitely has a curved, gradual beak. So gradual beak is going to be the spinner dolphin. If we go on and try to figure out what the name of this guy is, then we can go back to step 1. And step 1 is it colored black, white, and gray? Yes. So we go to step 2. This guy has a pointed beak, so we go on to step 3. And if we look and see if it's got sharply defined black and white patches, it doesn't. It has the gray and blended. So that would be Silurna longitaureus or the Pacific white-sided dolphin. Here we have one with plants. It's essentially the same idea, asking a series of questions. So does it make seeds or doesn't it? If it does, we go to the right in our diagram. It's just a series of choices, only in this case it's in graphic form. Let's review one last time. That's it for our session on classification. The groupings of the different taxa, domains, and kingdoms specifically we'll do separately. As always, come see me if you have any questions.